It's a pleasure to be with you this evening. I had the honor of being on the Israeli National Security Council just in the years where the Indo-Israeli relationship was really taking off in the early 2000s. The relationship of formal ties had been established, of course, a decade earlier, but this was the time when things were really happening, including the first strategic dialogues, and I had the so-called the India file on the National Security Council, organized and of course participated in the first strategic dialogues, and had the special experience, let me put it that way, of being in India in September 2001. We're sitting in a meeting of our delegation. The next morning, there's going to be a bilateral meeting on counterterrorism. And one of the guy's wives calls up in the middle and says, "I'm sorry, I have to interrupt, turn on CNN." And we see the second tower collapsing. And of course, that set the tenor for the meeting the next morning on counterterrorism. But the India-Israeli relationship is something that is dear to my heart. And again, I'm happy to be with you this evening. My talk is going to be a broad-stroked one about Israel's counterterrorism strategy. At first, I think it's important to note that Israel has faced ongoing terrorism since long before its formal establishment in 1948, actually since the 1920s. There is, I believe, a common misperception among many people in the world that terrorism is a Palestinian response to the post-1967 occupation. As I said, it started in the 1920s. Just last week, we had the latest in a long series of rounds with Hamas in Gaza. 1,200 rockets were fired into Israel in this round. At this point, we're talking a total of tens of thousands over the years and thousands by Hezbollah in Lebanon. Is the rocket threat really a terrorist threat? It's certainly a different one, different from the classic forms of terrorism, but it's a form of warfare, of political violence, which is directed almost entirely against civilians for the purpose of spreading terror. So I think it clearly fits the bill. But in addition to that, Israel faces the entire array of other terrorist threats, whether it's a simple knifing, it's car rammings, bombings, suicide bombings, cross-border attacks, etc. Israel faces a unique problem in that the terrorist organizations that it faces really don't have any specific demands that they want Israel to address, and that if Israel did so, the problem could be solved. Their problem is with Israel's fundamental existence. And so there really isn't much that Israel can do other than fight back here. I'm not dismissing the importance of diplomacy, because there is a role for that. But in the final analysis, if the enemy is committed to your destruction and says, under no circumstances will we reach a peace agreement with you, then you're inherently limited, for the most part, to military responses, at least with the terrorist organizations themselves. And the room for hearts and minds is much more limited in this case. Now, Israel's strategy overall, unsurprisingly, has been a combination of both offensive and defensive measures. The offensive ones include ongoing, very often round-the-clock counterterrorism operations to prevent attacks, to weaken, undermine enemy capabilities, interdiction of arms transfers, targeted killings, and the occasional major offense to reduce enemy capabilities. The defensive measures include security fences, security zones, roadblocks, checkpoints, border patrols, and of course, rocket defenses. One of the criticisms of Israel's counterterrorism strategy is that it, at least according to some people, it lacks a sufficient diplomatic component. Well, it depends on which government has been in office. Some governments have tried extensive diplomacy. But as I said, it's hard to go the diplomatic route, at least with the terrorist organizations, when they are committed to your destruction. And there's also a very strong component of international cooperation, including with India, especially with the United States and a number of other countries. Now, I think the really critical question is, how successful has the strategy been? We're all focused on results. And I would say that the answer is mixed. It depends which kind of terrorism you're talking about and how you define success, what your criteria are. Israel's fundamental assumption, its basic approach to counterterrorism or to terrorism, was that you can never put it out entirely. What Israel could hope to do was reduce it to a level that Israeli society could tolerate. And that meant a policy, in addition to what I was saying, of offense and defense, of course, of deterrence and retaliation. Now, in terms of the successes, I would say that the crowning achievement, the crowning success of Israel's counterterrorism policy is that it actually achieved the overarching objective, which is to keep terrorism to a level that Israeli society can not only tolerate, but actually thrive, and do so almost without regard to terrorism, as if it didn't exist. It's kept Israeli casualties very low over the years. The disruption to Israeli life overall, I'll come back to that in a minute, but overall quite minimal. The socioeconomic impact has been limited and fleeting. It's been localized. The only period in which terrorism actually had an effect at a national level, and a significant effect, in this case, a quite significant one, on the economy, was during the Second Intifada in the early 2000s, the very big wave of Palestinian terrorism at the time. As a matter of fact, Palestinian terrorism and the other forms of Hezbollah as well, it's produced a counter-reaction. It's actually strengthened Israeli societal resilience. That's not what they were trying to achieve, of course, just the opposite. Created strong national unity, strong public support for the various military operations over the years. And so I think overall, Israel's counterterrorism has been extraordinarily successful. It's also succeeded in preventing or minimizing the various forms, whether it's the knifings, the car rammings, bombings, and especially suicide bombings. Cross-border, the cross-border attacks was the big problem from the 70s up to through the 90s, early 2000s. Well, Israel basically succeeded in crossing off the border, the different borders, almost completely. And so the adversaries, whether it was Hezbollah and Hamas, tried to go over the border by rockets. And Israel hasn't been able to prevent it completely, but it's greatly reduced the threat through rocket defenses, especially the Iron Dome system. Well, if the enemy couldn't go through or over the border, so they tried going underneath it by tunneling. And Israel has built a underground defensive system which has put an end to the tunnel threat. They tried going around it through the sea. Israel's managed to close off its naval borders. And in the last few years, they've also tried a different way of going over it, mostly using balloons, kites, flaming balloons, or incendiary balloons, and some drones. It's been reasonably successful in preventing that as well. I think the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, have succeeded in disproving the theory that conventional armies cannot defeat terrorism. They can. The biggest failure has been the cumulative impact of terrorism over the years on Israel's public opinion, and consequently on electoral outcomes and the peace process. Terrorism has led to a significant hardening in public attitudes. They've become considerably more hardline in the last couple of decades. The second Intifada, again, the big wave of Palestinian terrorism in the early 2000s, decimated Israel's pro-peace camp. It was at the height of the peace process, and they launched this wave of terrorism. The two things did not seem to go together. People have lost faith in the prospects for peace with the Palestinians. The result is that this loss of faith in the peace process and just the impact of the horrors of the Intifada were that terrorism actually determined the outcome of a number of elections, swayed them in favor of the right wing. And this also led to a hardening of Israel's negotiating positions with the Palestinians. Leaders were forced to stake out harder line positions to avoid appearing weak. And so the peace process has suffered as well. Israel has succeeded in deterring acts of terrorism, but hasn't succeeded in preventing the buildup of terrorist capabilities. Over the years, they've built up their capabilities continually. We saw, for example, in 2000, Hezbollah was thought to have something like 7,000 rockets, and today they're thought to have a truly mammoth arsenal of somewhere about 150,000 rockets. So far, Israel does not have an effective offensive response to the rocket threat, whether from Hezbollah or Hamas. Offensive operations reduce the threat a little bit, but there's no effective capability to prevent rocket fire, to suppress it. And the result is that Israel has been forced to rely increasingly on defense, on Iron Dome and other systems. And if I said before that terrorism has never led to significant disruptions in Israeli life, well, that's not true on the local level, because the areas near the borders have been disrupted significantly. And actually, national life, at least the sense of security, is disrupted by the various rounds. And if and when the next major round with Hezbollah erupts, I tend to think it's more a question of when rather than in. As I said, 150,000 rockets. Israel's home front will suffer a level of devastation unlike anything we have ever experienced. I'd much rather be on the Israeli side of the border than the Lebanese side, but that's really of little comfort. It's going to be extremely ugly. And what's making the threat even worse today is that Hezbollah, with Iran's help, supplied by Iran, has a growing arsenal of precise rockets. In other words, they're no longer these inaccurate rockets where you can hope to hit a build-up area. Here you can put it on a dime, and that means that they can disrupt IDF mobilization, IDF operations, hit the civilian home front very hard, civilian infrastructure, power stations, water facilities, communications nodes. As I said, it's going to be very, very ugly. And Israel faces a fundamental quandary here, in that really the only way to do anything effective about the rocket threat, to really reduce it, whether Hezbollah in Lebanon or Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza, the only effective way to deal with it is actually to go in and conquer all of Lebanon or all of Gaza, occupy it for a period at least of months, go house to house to root out the rockets in bloody hand-to-hand fighting. This is something that no one in Israel wants to do. No one wants to have to occupy these areas, don't want to have to pay the price in casualties. And the real problem is that even if Israel is ultimately forced to do it, once it withdraws, the rocket arsenals will probably be rebuilt rather quickly by Iran at a cost, and we can do this, but at a cost of heavy Israeli casualties, and even heavier for the other side. The bottom line is Israel is reasonably effective in terms of defense, especially against a limited threat such as Hamas. The response is not sufficient for a threat on the level of Hezbollah. and the precise rocket threat is growing and is a severe threat. And let me conclude with a few examples of some of the paradoxes, some of the contradictions that Israel's run into over the years in its counterterrorism policies. Effective deterrence, effective counterterrorism deterrence, can require harsh and even disproportionate responses at times. But that can actually lead to an overall increase in the level of terrorism, at least in the short term. And it certainly leads to an international backlash. A failure to respond to terrorism will embolden one's enemies, dishearten one's own people. But retaliation can, again, exacerbate the situation, cause more casualties, and certainly increase the international response, exacerbating. The use of military measures leads to the international condemnation that Israel seeks to avoid, but so do economic measures. On the other hand, if you don't do anything, well, that's not very effective either. Israel's counterterrorism operations have caused a significant deterioration in its international standing over the years, even though it's been defending itself. Conversely, Palestinian terrorism has succeeded in putting the Palestinian cause on the international agenda, in convincing the international community that their grievances must be redressed. Palestinian excesses during the Second Intifada did harm their image, and there was greater international understanding of Israel's security concerns, led the international community to temporarily turn away from the Palestinians, but it was short-lived. Israel succeeded in expelling the PLO from Lebanon in 1982. It was a big success, but the result was even worse. It got Hezbollah instead. Israel withdrew from every inch of Gaza in 2005, dismantled all of the settlements that were there, dismantled 4 more settlements in the West Bank. This was supposed to be an indication of its willingness to go ahead with the Palestinians if they took effective control, showed that they could govern, put an end to terrorism. The result, of course, as I said before, was tens of thousands of rockets. So, as I said, numerous paradoxes, contradictions. This is the way it is in counterterrorist policy. Overall, I think Israel's experience has been extremely successful, but the picture is mixed. Thank you.